Hi everyone, Liz from Tutor2 Health and Social Care here, joined by Lynn. Hi Lynn, how are you doing?
Hi everyone, evening, hi.
So you're joining us for our Component 3 Health and Wellbeing exam clinic for the BTEC Tech Award. So hopefully you guys have got lots of questions for us. We do have some top tips to share as well. Just to let you know that if you want to ask a question, you type your question in the chat. You do have to be a subscriber to our channel to do that. Okay, so Lynn, let's think about revision first of all. So bearing in mind we've got 1 week until our exam, how should we be revising in this next week?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key thing is to make sure that your revision that you're going to be doing for the Component 3 exam next week is really active. Okay, so not just copying your notes time and time again out or doing lots of highlighting, although we like highlighting, being really active with your revision. So thinking about things that you can be doing that's really testing your ability to recall your knowledge. So that might be doing some flashcards. You might have questions on one side of the flashcard with the answers on the other side and you test yourself. Or you might have to explain what you've learned about the different topics in this component to a friend, where you're actively having to show that you understand things. So try and be really active with your revision. Make sure it's purposeful, but also making sure it can be a little bit challenging for you. Mm-hmm. And then I really recommend doing some timed exam questions. So practicing lots of different question types from past papers, revisiting questions that you might have used in a mock exam or a practice in your class, and practicing the different question types, how to approach them, and making sure that you do them in a good amount of time. So, for example, there's 2 6-mark discuss questions in the exam, isn't there? So practice how to answer a question like that, making sure that you look at strengths and weaknesses, or positives and negatives in your answer, and practicing trying to fill the page and having nice, big, in-depth explanations to what you're writing can really kind of build your confidence ready for those longer answer questions.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favourite things for revision is concept maps. I love a
Yep.
concept map. It's a really good way to kind of test your knowledge and how well you've remembered things. So a good concept map to do might be on the factors. So as you'll know, there's 6 different factor categories. So you've got your physical factors, your lifestyle, your social, your cultural, your economic, and your environmental. So you might want to write one of those categories on the page, and then you might want to talk about what goes into each of those categories. So if it's lifestyle, you'll be doing alcohol, smoking, substance misuse, for example. And then you might, off each of those factors, write what would the impact be on different pies. So that's a really good way to sort of get yourself ready for like the first sort of 1 to 8 questions in the exam. So, but you could also do a concept map, or as we've got on the screen there, a brain dump, where you just write down everything that you know about blood pressure or heart rate or BMI, for example, or even, sorts of things that formal support could do, or sorts of things that informal support can do. So really kind of trying to recall the knowledge that you've been learning in your lessons over the last few months. What I'd also really recommend you do is try and do a whole paper in time conditions this week. So you know that you've got 2 hours for the exam, but actually, you might be able to do that quicker at home. But, just so you know what the whole paper feels like, which areas you might find more tricky, and that can help guide your revision as well. That's a good thing to do. But don't do a whole paper the night before your exam. You want to make sure that you are refreshed, and a good night's sleep the night before the exam is actually probably worth more than just cramming into the early hours of the morning trying to do a past paper. So definitely think about the night before the exam. So this time, next bank holiday Monday, be thinking about just focusing on recall, going back through over your notes and not doing anything too heavy. Now is the time, this week, to get cracking on your revision and really practicing different question types.
Yep. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions. So let's have a look. So Ebony said there's only 2 available exam past papers, so don't know what other papers to do. Ebony, hopefully your teacher has given you some past papers to do, or some that they've created themselves. There's actually 2 per year, so there are at least 4 past exam papers, probably 5 now, isn't there, that you could be using. Tutor2 does have some past papers, but you do have to buy them, so I appreciate that might not be what you want to do. Another thing you could do is have a look at our live streams that we've done in the past. The replays are available on the website. And we also have an exam paper walkthrough. If you haven't seen that already, definitely have a look at that. I will put a link to that after we've finished the live stream into the comments. And that does have some worked exam answers, which Lynn has done for us, and it's brilliant. So let me just...
I can see lots of people saying that they've done lots of revision in the chat as well, which is really good. So well done, everybody, on doing that.
Okay, let's have a look at our next slide, because I think that relates to some of the questions that we've got coming in. So what should I revise? Really important to talk about what we should be revising. So Lynn, what are your recommendations? You've said some already.
So remember that this exam is focused on component 3. So hopefully you've got lovely organised folders or workbooks for everything that you've been studying for health and social care for the TEC Award. But you're focusing on the bit on component 3. So I hope that your teacher has given you a copy of the specification. If not, you can just download that from the Pearson website. And in that specification, it's all the things that are listed in component 3. And anything in component 3 may be tested. But what's good about this exam is we do know that it kind of follows a bit of a format in terms of like the themes of the types of things that come up. So we do know that the first sort of 1 to 8 questions in the exam are always focused on factors that affect health and well-being. So I listed those factors just a minute ago. So really know your factors and the factors categories, and try and use the terminology that's used in the specification around those factors as well, just to make sure you're being as accurate as possible. So really know your factors. And I think that's the kind of the most accessible content. It feels quite, a bit easier than some of the other more challenging things later on in the paper. And then I would think about life events. So we know that there's different types of life events. There's physical life events, so like accident or injury. We know that there's life events around relationship changes, so like divorce or marriage, for example. And we know that there are other life events that are more about life circumstances. So that might be moving school, moving house, maybe people going to prison. So maybe practice some of the more common life events and just think, okay, can I think of a physical, an intellectual, an emotional, and a social impact of those? So that might be quite fun. You could do that by talking to a friend about life events and just kind of like brainstorming between you the impact of that. And then the things that are a little bit more challenging are the BMI, the blood pressure, and the heart rate classifications. I know people find that more tricky. So obviously you need to know the different classifications for that 1 mark question that will always be like a classification question. But maybe focus on knowing the ideal range for all of those to start with, and make sure you can remember the ideal. And then hopefully when the question comes up, if something's a bit higher than that or a bit lower, then you're going to feel, okay, well, I can write higher or lower. But obviously if you can know all the classifications off by heart, that's great. And then you need to think about, okay, so if somebody has a high BMI, or a low BMI, or a high blood pressure, for example, or a really fast heart rate, what impact does that have on their current health, or what impact would that have in their future health? So you might want to do some nice tables of, current effects and future effects for each of those physiological indicators. So that bit's going to be a bit harder and it is a bit more tricky. So you might want to do that, buddy up with somebody, revise around that, have a look at some of the resources that you can find online about those things. As Liz mentioned, we've got some previous live streams that we've done on revision on those different areas, so you could have a look at those. And then finally, think about the ways that formal and informal support can help. So normally in the exam, it will give you an example of the type of support. So whether maybe that's coming from a professional, or it's coming from a neighbour, or it's coming from a friend. But you need to think about ways that those people can help. So what things do they actually do? So do they provide emotional support or practical help? Or might they refer you on? So just have a nice number of different things about the ways that people can help. What are they actually going to do? I would say that's where I would focus, maybe on this list, because we know that the barriers and obstacle question that comes towards the end of the paper, that's quite informed by what's in the case study quite often. So sometimes you can't be maybe as prepared for that one, but definitely really focus on those things on the screen there. And if you know your factors inside and out, then you're going to start the paper off really confidently, because we know that there's lots of factors questions.
Okay, Lynn, so we've got a question from Joe, which is about the classifications for BMI, blood pressure and heart rate. That's the one that you were missing there, Joe. I just thought, Lynn, it's worth repeating what you said. If you struggle to memorise the information, make sure you know what the ideal classification or the ideal measurement is for each of those. And as Lynn said, you can then quite easily work out if it's too high or too low from there.
Yeah, and Liz, just to reiterate, there you can find those specific numbers in the specification under component 3, under the physiological indicators section. Okay, so that's definitely all the numbers that you need to try and memorise. They're in the specification.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then I've got another one from Renea, who said, what are the factors? So I know that you told us them at the beginning, but can we just have a recap of the factors, Lynn?
Yeah, definitely. And also they are in the specification. So all the ones that you need to know, they are on the specification. And I'm just going to tell you, I've got the spec here. It's on page 41 of the spec. So if you can get your hands on the specification, if you haven't got it in your folder from school, then just Google after the session today, Pearson BTEC Tech Award specification, and go to page 41, and then you'll see all the factors categories listed there, okay? So you've got lifestyle factors, and then within that are things like smoking, alcohol, substance misuse, physical exercise and diet. You've got your physical factors, you've got your social and cultural factors, and then you've got your economic and you've got your environmental factors. So within each of those categories, there's between about 4 and 6 things that you need to know. And you will start the paper with some multiple choice questions that ask you to identify, a lifestyle factor or a social factor, for example. So definitely revise those, and you can pick up some nice marks at the beginning there.
Okay, there's another question that's just come in, which I think is really important just to address in case anyone's panicking. So Cassie said, hello, I was just wondering if peak flow is going to be in this exam. My teacher said no, because it's not in the specification, but I just wanted to check. No, you should not get anything on peak flow in your exam paper because it's no longer in the specification. So you can rest easy, Cassie. You don't need to do that one.
Your teacher, yes.
Yeah. Another question that I think is important at the moment is from Abdullah. Abdullah says, will there be any questions from component 1 or 2?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Abdullah. So not really specifically, however, so focus your revision on component 3. However, the exam is called a synoptic exam. So that means that your learning from component 1 and component 2 will be really useful kind of as part of your overall knowledge to help you when you answer the component 3 exam. And you might have noticed that in component 1, you learned about all of the factors already in component 1, and then you came back and revisited them in component 3, for example. You also touched on barriers and obstacles earlier on in your component 2, I think it comes up. So I wouldn't say go back and revise all your component 1 and component 2 things, because the component 3 specification is quite sort of clear on what to cover. But, if you've got something that you think's really useful and you learnt it from component 1 or 2 and you think it would value and contribute to your answer, pop it in when you're in the exam, but don't sort of worry too much about going back over your component 1 and component 2 notes. Would you agree, Liz?
I would agree, yeah. The only thing I'm thinking about are the discuss questions. You obviously have to know your life stages, and you have to know different features of the life stages. So hopefully you've got that ingrained in your mind from when you did component 1, but it might be worth having just a quick brief look to refresh your memory about what happened, key things that happen in the life stages, and some of the life events as well, just so that when you get that context, that case study for the discuss questions, you can say, oh yep, I know about this and I can relate that to what I'm being asked. One more question before we move our slide on. So from Robin said, can you do too much revision? I think I've done that. That's a really good question. Robin, if you think you've done too much revision, maybe give yourself a couple of days off to just rest and breathe and let it all consolidate in your mind. I think you can definitely stress yourself out by trying to over prepare. I'm not sure that you can do too much revision, but yeah, give yourself a couple of days off to let it all sink in, and then maybe see how you feel in a couple of days' time. Anything you would add on that, Lynn?
No, I mean, I think, maybe just vary the revision that you're doing. If you sort of feel like you've done too much, maybe think, okay, well, maybe I'm just going to do something a bit lighter. You could look back over some of our live streams that are probably a bit more fun, engaging in the PowerPoints, maybe try and pair up with a friend. And kind of do a Q&A with each other. So maybe just vary the style that you're doing so that you don't feel like you're constantly rereading your notes, for example. Or maybe just look back on your mock and think, okay, where did I, lose marks? Where did I not do as well? And maybe just focus on those areas. But yeah, I'm a big advocate of, having rest in between and then coming back to things. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just reviewing the questions, and a lot of them, I think, relate really well to what we're going to go on to. I'm just favoriting them so I don't miss them. Okay, let's have a look then at our next slide. So time management, we've got some questions about that. So let me see. Okay, we've got a couple of interesting ones on time management. So let me see. Let's go with this one first. So Lauren's saying, how do you recommend using the time effectively? As I completed the exam paper in my lesson and we were given an hour to do so, and I finished with high marks. So how do I use all of the 2 hours? So before, I'll let you think about that one, Lynn. I'm just going to go through what we've got on the slide so everyone's on the
Sure.
same page. So our Tech Award Component 3 exam is 2 hours long and there are 60 marks available. There are 18 questions. Some of those questions are split into A and B. So you have approximately 2 minutes for every mark available. There are approximately 4 case studies on there, so 4 different individuals, so you need to take time to read those. And it's important to remember you've got 2 6-mark extended response questions. So Lynn, 2 hours is quite a long exam. What are your top tips for making sure they're using this time effectively?
Yeah, so I think on first look, it feels like it's quite a long time. And actually, on the face of it, sometimes the questions feel quite easy or accessible. However, you've got to remember that an exam is very much about applying your knowledge to the case studies and being really accurate with your answers, and also showing a lot of health and social care knowledge and terminology, for example. So you actually do need to make sure that every question you're taking time to read really accurately, so that you don't sort of misinterpret the question or miss the meaning of the question. So very much say you need to read every question at least twice. Some questions you need to annotate, so be underlining. For example, is it asking for a positive effect or a negative effect? Is it a social well-being or is it emotional well-being that it's talking about? So you need to spend a bit of time reading those questions carefully and underlining the key pieces of information so you don't miss anything and you don't lose marks unnecessarily. Also, with the case studies, you need to read them. You need to annotate and highlight relevant information. So particularly for the 6-marker questions, you need to be trying to write depth and breadth to your answer. So you don't really want to be missing anything from the case study that could potentially be quite useful for you to be talking about and expanding on. So I definitely would say don't rush it. Take your time, read everything carefully, utilize the case studies, because if there is a case study there, it's there for a reason. It's there to make sure that your answer is relevant to it. So that's super important. And also with the explain questions, they're often worth 2 or 4 marks. And as we'll talk about in a minute, they're often awarded in pairs. So you often get a point for identifying and then a point for a further expansion. Quite often, students only get about 50% of those marks because they don't kind of fully explain their answers well enough. So we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute, but making sure your explanations are full. And then your 6-mark longer answer questions are nicely structured and they've got a good amount of balance. So actually, if you do the exam paper really accurately and really carefully with enough depth and breadth, you probably find you'll be getting to an hour and 45 minutes sort of before you know it. So don't rush it. That would be my advice, yeah.
Okay, so Amelia says, are you allowed to highlight in the exam? Sounds stupid.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a big fan of highlighting or underlining, annotating. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely fine because you're kind to, circle information or give arrows to things that you're going to use in your answer. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's just put our next slide up because we've talked about some of the question types. I've noted quite a lot of questions and I have favorited them, guys, so don't worry, we're going to get to them. So Lynn, you said that we have some identify, state and give questions at the beginning of the paper to kind of break us in gently. So do you want to just briefly talk us through those?
Yeah, so if you see a command word identify, state, give, they're kind of designed to be shorter answer questions. You're not going to be writing loads for these. You're going to be giving, a couple of word answers or maybe a sentence, for example. So, and also some of these are multiple choice questions. So you've got some boxes where you can tick, for example. So particularly with these are the ones that I said seem quite easy on the first look, but often see students misinterpreting. It will say, the effect of something on emotional well-being, and then they'll give a social answer, or they'll talk about impact on BMI because they just thought that it said any type of health and well-being. So really important to read the questions carefully, and also make sure that your answer matches the case study, the context, because although your answer might be plausible, it might be feasible, it's something that could potentially be correct, but if it's not in the context of the question, you might lose marks because of that, because if you're writing the plan, for example, where you have to talk about actions and ways, but you talk about something that's not relevant to the context at all, then that's where you could lose marks. So just be really careful reading it. Make sure you read the case study. And with these types of answers, if it asks you for 2 of something, so for example, 2 positive effects of getting married, for example, on health and well-being, make sure your answers are sufficiently different to each other. So, you don't want to say, oh, well, they'll feel happier and they might feel more positive in themselves. Maybe that's too similar an answer. You need to make sure that you're saying things that are different. So you might have increased confidence, or you might have increased happiness, for example. So make sure they're sufficiently different to each other. And remember, you've learned all that lovely health and social care juicy terminology throughout your course, haven't you? You know all these lovely words like self-esteem, self-confidence, the positive and negative effects of things, talking about them in a really nice health and social care way. So try and be precise, be accurate, and use key terms. And you don't need to repeat the question in your answer. So you don't have to rewrite the whole question, then give your answer. You can just dive straight in and give your answer, because you're just wasting time by repeating the question. The examiner's not going to give you any marks just for writing the question out. So just, try and be as concise as you can. And I would say sometimes if you're not sure, give more than one answer. And then the examining is positive marking. So, they'll look to mark the correct answers.
Okay. So explain questions. We've got quite a few questions about those. So we've got Poppy saying, can we have some advice or tips on how to achieve 4 out of 4 on the 4 markers?
Good question.
Who else is asking that? I've got so many questions to wade through. Let me just have a quick scroll. Here we go. Okay, Riho, how are we meant to answer explain questions? I mostly lose marks on these and went from a distinction to a merit on a mock I did in class. I would say, first of all, before we ask Lynn this question, don't worry about that happening. Lots of students find this difficult. Explain questions are more difficult than they first seem. So, Lynn, talk us through a really nice way to get full marks for these explain questions.
So explain questions, just before we start, they do come up a lot. There's about 9 in the paper, and they come up throughout the paper. So you'll start to see explain questions at the beginning. So for example, they might ask you to talk about 2 positive effects of a particular life event, for example. They might ask you then to talk about or to explain the impact of a physiological indicator, so a high BMI, for example, or blood pressure on future health. So that's going to be an explain question in that area. You might come across an explain question that's about explain ways that formal support could help an individual, or informal support. And then also explain is used in the barriers and obstacle question. So it comes up a lot. So we've got to try and get the technique right. So the key thing to remember is that the examiner's always going to award it in pairs. So an explain question is kind of making a point and then expanding on that point. So if you just write sort of one sentence that's just giving one piece of information, so for example, explain 2 positive effects that are becoming a parent, if you just wrote increased self-esteem, you're just going to get 1 mark. But you've got to go further than that and say what is it about becoming a parent that causes that increase in self-esteem. So for example, you might say a positive effect of becoming a parent is increase the self-esteem because you feel that you have a clear purpose in life, for example. So you've gone on to develop that answer. So you need to make a point and then go on to explain it. And the way I quite like to talk about it is what is the effect or the impact, and then so what? So what, or how, or why did that occur? So try and give as much explanation as you can. And often students that write a bit more for these questions tend to kind of finally pick up the mark because they kind of get there in the end. So I think if you're not writing much for these answers, you're probably not going to get the full amount of marks unless you've got like the most amazing technique. But I think, even Liz and I, or teachers, sometimes, we can struggle to get the accurate amount of information. So write as much as you can within the space, and try and use your technical terms and your vocabulary, because that can really help you pick up marks. And really think about the question. What is the question asking you? And don't just repeat information in the question, or don't just repeat information in the case study, because that's not going to be where your marks come from. Your marks are going to come from you kind of developing the question and giving your answers, if that makes sense. So, and just make sure that your answer is very much relevant to the context of what's being asked, and obviously the question that's being asked. And actually, if you have time at the end, why don't you go back and check on your explain answers? They're probably the ones where you might be able to go, oh, actually, I'm going to add a bit more onto those.
That's a good tip, actually, Lynn. And what you can do when you go back and check those is say, ask yourself, what, so what? Especially the so what bit, because that's the bit that we forget. So for any explain question, say to yourself, so what? And if you haven't fully said the what or the how or the why, then you haven't answered the question. So add some more. I've probably lost track of it, but there was a question about, let me just see if I can find it. Yes, here we go. So Ebony said, say it's a 2 marker and you put 4 points, can you be marked down? Absolutely not, Ebony. So there are no marks taken away on this exam paper. You can only gain marks. So if you give more information than is needed, that's fine. That's just more information. So, you know, if you've got more points to make them in case some of your others are not as strong, so long as you've got space on your exam paper. But remember, you can ask for extra paper. And the other thing, just before we move on, we had some question, here we go, from Adriana, and some others were saying about this as well. My school said we can't highlight in the answer booklets. What if they disqualify me? You absolutely can. You can annotate the exam paper. You can highlight things on the exam paper. It does not disadvantage you at all, does not disqualify you from it. Lynn and I have both marked thousands probably of exam papers and exam questions. Students that perform really well have often written little notes to remind themselves, little acronyms, you know, what, so what, things like that to remind them, and it's not going to disadvantage you at all. Okay, let's move on to the next question type then, Lynn. So we've got this health and wellbeing, improving health and wellbeing tables, usually question 16A, isn't it? Where you have to talk about actions and ways. So Lynn, talk us through this one.
Yeah, so this can be a bit tricky if you haven't done lots of practice on this. So try and make sure that you're familiar with question 16A. It looks like a table, okay? And it's got a column that talks about actions in terms of how somebody can improve their health and well-being. And then the next column is the ways that those actions lead to an improvement in health and well-being. So we just wanted to remind you about the importance of completing the table accurately. So it might seem quite straightforward in the first instance, but actually there's lots of common mistakes that students make. Okay, so you need to read the case study and really think about the improvements that the person needs to make in their life. So what actions can they take to improve their health and well-being? Hopefully from the case study, they'll be quite obvious. So if the person's a smoker, for example, an action could absolutely be to give up smoking or to cut down smoking or to seek professional help, you know, from a stop smoking advisor or something. So normally they'll be relatively obvious from the case study, and they'll very much be around the things that you're used to seeing. So people might be smoking too much, they might be drinking alcohol, they might not be doing enough exercise, they might have a poor diet. So go with the obvious things that you see in the case study, and you need to give 3 actions. Make sure those actions are all different from each other. Okay, so that you're quite clear. And the action must be a doing word, because it needs to be an action. You're giving a recommended action. So it must be something the person needs to do. So you can't just write in the box smoking, alcohol, substance misuse, because that's not an action. What are they actually going to do? Are they going to reduce their alcohol consumption, or are they going to increase their physical activity? So you need to make sure that you're using a doing word in your action. And then the action and the way need to be linked. So what you write in that bit of the box, the way needs to match that one. Okay, if it matches that one down there, you're not going to get the mark. They need to kind of just all the way across need to match each other. So don't repeat information in the ways as well. You can't say reduce cardiovascular disease, reduce cardiovascular disease, reduce cardiovascular disease for each of your things. Stopping smoking, reducing alcohol, and increasing exercise might have that outcome. You can't use the same way more than once. So just remember that you need to have different information, and make sure that your actions and ways are directly applied to the case study. Okay, so just need to be in that context. They need to flow and link to each other, and they need to be sufficiently different. And again, use your nice health and social care terminology. I would focus quite a lot on physical health. I think, they tend to kind of encourage the more positive answers, and really try and use it, quite often a way reduces the risk of something, reduces the risk of lung cancer or reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. That can be quite useful in terms of your ways. So just have a little practice of doing that. And Beth, to answer your question then, how do you do it without repeating the same answer? Have some ready-made ones practiced at home. I would focus on, all the lifestyle factors really that you've learnt about, and what action would you give for smoking, alcohol, poor diet, lack of exercise, substance misuse, and then have a really good action and way prepared, because it's likely that those type of things are going to come up because they're the things that people need to improve about their lives. They're the common things that people are going to the GP about. So
absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, so let's have a look then. Loads of questions on these. Let's have a look at 6 mark discuss questions, Lynn. So I'm going to start actually. Let's think about before you tell us your top tips. So this person, who doesn't have an easy to say name, said, for the case studies, which bits should we be really looking at, or should we really be looking at? So you've got a small case study about a person, Lynn. What are the things that we need to be picking out of that? Maybe the things that we might want to highlight or circle or underline.
Yeah, definitely. So, you're going to get 2 types of 6 mark questions discussed. So question 15 is your first discuss. So that will ask you how the person in the case study circumstances could affect their ability to do something, which might be stop smoking or reduce alcohol consumption. So the key word in there is circumstances. You're trying to look in the case study and work out the person's circumstances that are positive things in that case study or negative things in the case study that are affecting their ability to do that. So the key thing is be looking for those, things that are like a positive in their life. Sometimes the case studies can maybe point a bit more to the negative, I've found over the past papers. So there might just be kind of like maybe 1 or 2 positives in there, like they might have a good source of support, for example, or they might have a good job, for example. And then also highlighting the negative circumstances. So they might have a negative peer group, or they might have just had a bereavement, for example, or they might be lacking motivation. So you want to try and pick out all of those pieces of information from the case study that you're going to use in your answer. And remember that the case study is your friend. It's there to help you to know what to write. So try and look for positive things about somebody's circumstances and negative things. That's what I would say to start with. And then
so that's 15. So
the
other one
15.
is 18.
Yeah, so the other one's 18. And that question is normally discuss how the individual in the case study's circumstances, again, that word circumstances, may affect a particular area of development in a particular life stage. So it's always kind of structured pretty much the same. It will name the area of development, could be physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. Last paper, it was emotional and social. So it'll always be an area of development. And then thinking about what life stage that person's been in. So they might be an infant, they might be an adolescence, later adulthood, for example. And again, you're thinking about their circumstances. So what is it that's negative in their circumstances or positive in their circumstances that could affect that area of development? Okay, so really thinking about that, and then thinking about that in the context of how old they are, really. That's kind of thinking, if, for example, they've had, they've lost their life partner and they're in later adulthood, that's going to have a huge impact, isn't it, in terms of, somebody being lonely or affecting their social development, for example. So, yeah, really think about, can I pull out the positives? Can I pull out the negatives? And then structure your answer around that. You might cover all the positives, then a negative, or vice versa, and fully explain why that circumstance is going to impact whatever the question is focused on.
So Olivia's saying that she finds it really hard to think of both positive and negative circumstances and is after some tips for identifying them more easily. I think what I would say is just think of it in terms of what is going to make things harder for this person and what things are going to make it easier for this person. So things that make it easier, because that's the bit that we often struggle with, isn't it? The positives are, do they have support? Have they already been to see a nurse or a doctor? Do they live with someone else? Do they have good financial resources? Do they live in a city that could be well connected? And then linked to that, we have another question from Ebony. Ebony's on fire with the questions tonight. Can you infer things from the 6-marker case study, or does it have to be something said in the case study only? Absolutely, you can kind of infer things, so long as you're not going totally wild. It has to be plausible for that case study. But if it says the person lives in a city, then you can infer and assume that they will have access to facilities and resources. Equally, if it said they lived in a rural area, you could assume that maybe they won't have access to resources. So you can do things with those case studies. So, Lynn, is there anything else you wanted to add to 6-mark discuss questions?
Not really. Shall I just talk about I'll just go through our main points there then, Liz, on the screen.
Yep.
So just, I think the key thing is the case study should be giving you a good, at least 4 things to be able to work with. It might not be balanced. There might be more positives than negatives, or there might be more negatives than positives. Don't worry. It doesn't have to be exactly the same number of positives and negatives that you talked about, just as long as you've kind of maybe been able to at least identify one from each sort of area. So aim to make a minimum of 4 really good points. Be specific and link your points back to the case study, but you don't have to repeat all of the case study in your answer. And make sure each point has a full explanation. So you're showing the examiner that you have read the case study, you're taking information from it, but you're developing it. So you're going, well, this could then therefore mean this. And that information is not in the case study. You're showing your knowledge. So that's really good. Consider positive and negative circumstances. I think that can really help you sort of get higher up in the mark bands. And then your discussion should be logical. So try to avoid just doing bullet points, because if you look at the levels-based mark scheme, it does say about having a discussion. Okay, so that is really implying that your answer, needs to be a nice paragraph where it flows and your points kind of nicely link onto each other, not just like bullet pointing information, because that will limit your marks. So make sure you've got a nice full sentences in nice paragraphs. And make sure you try and put in nice specialist language and terminology. So, if it's about social development for question 18, for example, you might be talking about things like social isolation or social exclusion or supportive relationships. You might even be talking about things like discrimination. So that nice terminology that you've learnt, or even for emotional, you'll be talking about, giving lots of nice emotional effects to support your points. So you're showing your knowledge of the different types of development. Really practicing these questions. Don't be too waffly. Try and use nice language, and try and make a minimum of 4 good points. And again, you can ask for extra paper for this question if you need to, especially if you've got big writing. If you've got quite small writing, then hopefully the page will be enough for you. But if you've got quite big writing, then you might go on and ask for an extra sheet. And try and keep your answers within the pages. That's quite important. When your exam papers go off, they get scanned before it goes to an examiner. So you need to just make sure that your work is all nicely within the boxes.
Yep. Okay, before we move on, Raisa says, how long should we spend on 6 markers roughly? So at the beginning of the stream, we said you've got 2 hours and you've got approximately 2 minutes per mark. So definitely 12 minutes you can spend on your 6 marker. But many people are saying to us that 2 hours is quite a long time and they maybe finish earlier. So you could possibly afford to give yourself a little bit more time. Or what you could do is give yourself 12 minutes the first time. And then if you get to the end of the paper, you've completed everything, you've still got some time, go and have a look at your 6 markers and see, can I add anything else? I think we've answered everything else about 6 markers. I'm just having a quick look through. Yeah, I think we have. So let's have a look at our final thoughts. And then I've got a couple of final thoughts questions, Lynn. So actually, I'm going to put Zara's question on, how can I deal with exam stress? So I think our final thoughts kind of link to this. So definitely get lots of sleep, Zara, as much as you can. To get good sleep, you need to have a set bedtime, avoid your screen time immediately before bed, not looking at your phone or your Kindle or your tablet whilst you're laying in bed. Leave that downstairs so that you've got a nice, peaceful, calm environment to sleep in. You could eat brain food, so things like eggs, oily fish, leafy greens, dark chocolate, nuts and berries. And actually having a good diet just does reduce stress. Stay hydrated, so drink plenty of water, and try if you can to adopt a positive mindset. The fact that you have all come here to this live stream tonight tells me that you do have a positive mindset and you are looking at positive ways of coping with stress. Anything you want to add about dealing with exam stress, Lim?
Yeah, don't just, to try not to get too overwhelmed by, all of your revision. Don't open your folder and just look at everything and go, just break it down into chunks. Yeah, I think the important thing with revision is chunking. So just say, do you know what, today I'm just going to focus on this part. I'm just going to focus on factors. Tomorrow I'm going to focus on this. The next day I'm going to focus on this. So maybe giving yourself a revision timetable so you don't get overwhelmed. And you know what? If you don't get to that last thing on the revision timetable, don't worry. Hopefully everything you've done on the other categories and things like that will carry you through in the exam to do well. But, being organised can sometimes help with the stress, and just kind of like working your way through slowly but surely. And, if you feel really overwhelmed and stressed, definitely talk to somebody. I think that's the really important thing. Share your worries with somebody, because often actually just sometimes verbalising how you feel can make you feel better anyway. So, and if you're getting really a bit wound up and stressed, just stop, go for a walk, do some exercise, talk to someone. That can definitely really, really help.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm just looking. We've got some really detailed questions coming in now.
Okay.
Let me just have a look here. There was another one that I wanted to look at. I've lost it now. Oh yeah, here we go. Let's have a look at this one. So Robin, what's the best tip you have to prepare for the upcoming week? It's such a short time to cram it all in and remember.
It really is, isn't it? So, well, next Monday night, we're going to do kind of like a revision blast where we're just going to look at the different topic areas and we're just going to do some nice, not overwhelming, but just kind of nice basic retrieval, recall kind of practice. So definitely join us for that this time next week. Do have a look at our previous Tutor to You live streams that we've done. We've got lots of different revision type sessions that you could use. And Robin, you've got a week to go. So why don't you, off the back of now, just, work out what you're going to cover each day and just have a little plan for something that you're going to look at, which part of revision that you're going to do, maybe to make a time to buddy up with someone that's also doing the exam to talk that through. I think that can help and it can make revision a bit more enjoyable as well.
Yeah. So I've just put a question from an everyday gamer on there, which I'm going to answer. Where do we go to find out what we need to revise for this exam? So after the live stream has finished, probably a bit later because I haven't had any tea yet. So after I've eaten my food, I will upload this PowerPoint onto the Tutor to You website. I will also, in the comments for this live stream, because you can watch it on a replay, go back to the replay, have a look in the comments, and I will post a series of links for you. I will link to the specification, the live stream replays, any free resources that we have on the Tutor to You website. So come back and check. on the Tutor2 website, you can also download this PowerPoint. We just have some specific questions, Lynn, that I think
Okay.
we will just try and answer really quickly. So there's quite a few about barriers, and we didn't say much about barriers. So we've got questions like, is there a barriers question? What's the difference between an obstacle and a barrier?
Good questions.
And things like that. Beth, actually, I'm going to put Beth's comment on there, because Beth said barriers stop you from accessing care, for example, language, and obstacles are what you can overcome. Yeah, not a bad definition there, Beth.
Good start,
Lynn,
yeah.
just tell us briefly about barriers and obstacles. What's the difference between them? So Amira, I want to know, what's the difference between a barrier and an obstacle, and what kind of questions are we going to get on them? Because these are tricky ones, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. So questions 17A and 17B are your barriers and obstacles. So 17A is about barriers. So barriers are normally a barrier that the service is kind of putting in place. So, you know, the service may not be very accessible to somebody with a sensory disability, for example. So they've created the barrier. Okay, or they might not have information in different languages or have access to an interpreter. So therefore, there's a barrier that comes from the service. So that's question 17A. And then 17B is an obstacle question. And normally the obstacle is more unique to the individual, something that they have that they find difficult to overcome. So it might be that they, I'm trying to think of a good example. So they might not have access to very good financial resources, for example. They might not have enough time because they work shift work, for example, or they might lack motivation and be very unmotivated, or it might be that the targets that have been set for them are really unrealistic. So just think barrier is sort of normally comes from the service and it's linked to a service, and then obstacles more linked to the individual. However, what I would say is don't get too hung up on the difference between what is a barrier and obstacle, because you're not going to be asked in the exam to define the difference. What you're going to be asked to do is to read the case study information, and from that case study, identify the barriers and explain those barriers and how they're going to impact on the person being able to improve their health and well-being. So the barrier that you're going to talk about, you'll kind of get a hint from the case study. So it'll be kind of apparent really from the case study which barriers are being sort of talked about. And same for the obstacles. It'll, talk about, in broad terms, obstacles that a person has, and then you've got to explain that obstacle and why it's a barrier. Okay, so with these kind of questions, try and kind of write as much as you can, I would say. Explain the obstacle. Don't be short and sweet with it. Don't just write geographical barrier. Why is it a geographical barrier? Well, it's a geographical barrier because they live in a rural area, or it's a geographical barrier because there's no transport where they live. So you've got to try and explain the barrier as much as possible, and then say, how does it stop them from improving their health and well-being? So if, it's a geographical barrier because they live in a rural area and there's no bus, how does that stop them from improving their health and well-being? Well, they may not be able to access their health appointments and visit their GP, for example. So make a point about the barrier or the obstacle, kind of explain it, and then say, how does it prevent them from improving their health and well-being? So I would say kind of write a bit more for these ones, because you kind of hopefully will pick up the marks kind of in the end as you develop your explanations. And try not to over repeat all the information in the case study. If you just rewrite the case study, that's not going to get you the marks. There needs to be an interpretation of that case study, a development of it, showing that you're bringing knowledge to the table.
Okay, so just a couple more questions and then we should be finishing. So Rabina says, when a question asks for a risk, e.g. from smoking, does our answer need to include how or why that risk occurs? For example, resulting in a stroke, do we need to explain the process? So Rabina, if you're asked to explain why, explain a long-term risk or a short-term risk, then yes, you do need to explain the process. So why does smoking increase your risk of stroke? If you're just asked to identify or state, then you don't need to explain. Okay, So if it says explain, if that's the first word, explain the long-term risks of smoking, then you need to give a how or why, describe the process or the mechanism. If it's just state or identify or give, then you don't need to. This is going to be the last question we're going to go to, and it's from Cassie saying, how do you make sure you write the exact keywords in your answer as the mark scheme is so exact? Last time I lost quite a few marks as I didn't write the exact wording even though I had the right idea. So
That's
Cassie, the mark scheme is an indication of how you should answer, and it's actually written for examiners, not for students. And examiners should be looking at the mark scheme and then looking at your work and seeing, has Cassie made that same point? And so you don't have to write exactly what is on the mark scheme. And obviously, you know, examiners are trained to look at lots of different student answers and see how they fulfill the criteria of the mark scheme. So don't get too hung up on that. Try and use keywords as much as you can, but you are not expected to write exactly what's on the mark scheme, because there are so many different ways of answering these questions and phrasing your answer. Anything you wanted to add on that one, Lynn?
I would just refer people back to that specification, because actually, just to make sure that you're using nice health and social care terminology, the specification really helps identify that. That's kind of the main thing that I would say. So particularly with the factors questions, you know, you do need to kind of know what factors are in what category so that you're picking the right answers and those kind of things. So just refresh yourself with the specification, because that will really help develop your health and social care language. Yeah.
Okay, so just to remind you, Lynn has already said about this, we're doing an exam warm-up next Monday evening at 6:30 p.m. It is a bank holiday, guys, so you're not going to be at school that day. So you've got to remember for yourselves that we're doing the exam warm-up. If you're on Instagram, I will post a couple of reminders for you, and you can also set up a remind me on Instagram and also on YouTube as well. We're going to do some fun low stakes revision and quizzing to warm you up, so nothing too stressful. And I would say this should be the only thing you do the night before the exam. You shouldn't be doing any more revision after we've done our exam warm up. You should just be getting a nice early night, eating lots of lovely food and preparing yourself for the next day. So I will post those links onto the comments a bit later on, so do come back and look for those. Good luck with your revision over the next week, and we will be back next Monday. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.